Welcome to Family Addiction Coaching, a podcast about families supporting a loved one with addiction. Each episode will provide insight into a real family's experience, what families find useful and not, what is available in the community, and what would help make their journey easier. Similar to what happens in our coaching service, we'll discuss how families have encouraged their loved one into recovery, as well as their own family recovery. We'll also discuss harm reduction, an especially useful approach for those with no current interest in recovery. I'm your host, Patrick Doyle of Family Addiction Coaching. With a master's degree in social work, I'm licensed by the state of Massachusetts and comply with the strict code of ethics of the National Association of Social Workers. This episode of Family Addiction Coaching was published in January as an episode of his Talk to Me Doc podcast by its creator and emergency medicine specialist, Dr. Andrew Tisser. It's a fascinating exploration of the intersection of family coaching and medicine, offering an innovative approach to improve the effectiveness of medical providers helping patients with addiction. Providers who recognize families as a valuable source of recovery capital will see improved treatment outcomes for their patients with addiction. Humble thanks and great appreciation to Dr. Tisser for this opportunity to amplify his valuable messaging of support to physicians and their careers. Dr. Tisser, welcome to Family Addiction Coaching Podcast.
As physicians, how do we deal with addiction, both in ourselves, in our patients, and our family members? How do we change the narrative to be less stigmatizing? Learn the answers to these questions and many more on this episode of the Talk to Me Doc podcast.
Welcome to the Talk to Me Doc podcast, where it's all about serving the early career physician. Let's talk about the unique issues that face us so we can create a better future for ourselves and those to come. And now your host, Dr. Andrew Tisser.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Talk to Me Doc podcast. I am so happy you're here. For my returning listeners, thank you so much. For my new listeners, welcome. Today, like on every episode, we're bringing you the best guests from all around healthcare and beyond to discuss issues relating to the early career physician. Today, we're discussing a sometimes challenging subject, but an important one, namely addiction. And I'm bringing on Patrick Doyle onto the show. Through his program, Family Addiction Coaching, Patrick Doyle provides coaching services to help families recover from addiction. While most coaches work with a person with addiction, Patrick has seen family involvement improve treatment outcomes for patients. Supporting families with addiction for more than 30 years, Patrick earned a Master of Social Work degree from Boston College and is licensed as a clinical social worker. Patrick has worked in a full range of healthcare settings, including emergency medicine, acute medical dual diagnosis, and intensive outpatient programs for addiction. Patrick served for several years as a substance use consultant for the Boston Red Sox organization, helping them win their World Series title in 2004. With drug overdoses increasing over recent years, Patrick has dedicated himself to using science-based information to help families gain health and recovery. He has also found a love for the podcasting medium and has created the Family Addiction Coaching podcast, available at familyaddictioncoach.com and all major outlets. Well, I know I'm excited, so let's bring Patrick onto the show. Patrick Doyle, welcome to the Talk to Me Doc podcast.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
Well, Patrick, I'm really happy to have you here, and I've already recorded a little bit about you for the listeners, but in your own words, could you tell everybody what you do, who you are, and your role in healthcare?
Well, thank you, Andy, and it's a real pleasure to be on your show. I've listened to several episodes and have really been impressed and encouraged by the information that you're pushing forward. Very well done, I would say. I've been working basically as a clinical social worker for a few decades in the field. While always having interest in addiction in particular, what I've done the past few years especially is to really focus on working with families and close friends of people with addiction, particularly using a certain approach that has been shown to bring 70% of people with addiction into treatment when you're working with the family. So I've seen spectacular results with that. So it's really become my passion, as it's such an enhancement and it improves treatment outcomes with addiction.
70%. So that's very impressive.
Yeah, it's unheard of, isn't it? In any area of medicine, just about, it seems.
This is true. So can you talk a little bit more about that approach, given those really nice numbers?
Sure. Yeah, it's called Community Reinforcement and Family Training, and it's abbreviated CRAFT. And it's a method that's been around for 25 years or so. And what's really interesting is that it has been studied and it has been compared to other more traditional approaches of working with families with addiction, the Al-Anon approach, and then also the Johnson intervention approach. Basically, CRAFT is very patient-centered, and it's very respectful. It's a lot like motivational interviewing approaches. It involves training the family on how to communicate best with a person with addiction and basically reinforcing positive behaviors whenever they see them and trying to turn away and ignore negative behaviors, which is just such a different way to approach this. What it does, the families report to me, is that it gives them such a sense of relief. It reminds me of child rearing, Andrew. You know, we know as parents, try to reinforce positive behavior from the child and try not to draw too much attention to the negative behavior. But for some reason, when we deal with adults and we deal with patients and with addiction, we seem to forget that. So it's a very effective approach. And what's really useful is that it helps the family get into their own recovery so that rather than being obsessed with the behavior of the person with the addiction, it allows them to focus more on their own lives. So if the person with addiction, for example, comes home and is under the influence, CRAFT would suggest to the family that you basically say, well, you know, I'm going to go to bed early. Here's some dinner if you want it. I'll talk to you later. Not give them much attention at all. If the person comes home and appears to be not under the influence, then engage them in a conversation and try to reward them in some sort of way with positive reinforcement. Spend time with them. Find anything to praise that you can. And we're really getting great results with families.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I haven't even heard of it myself, but that's pretty cool. So, you know, the reason I wanted to bring you on the show is for many reasons, but I think addiction and substance use is a big problem within our medical community, and of course, outside the medical community in the general population. The first thing I wanted to ask you about is we're seeing plenty of doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals, unfortunately, suffering from addiction, whether that be silently or not so silently, kind of as a coping mechanism to the kind of nonsense we got to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Sure.
And, you know, if someone out there is listening and is suffering from this themselves and is scared both for financial and professional and for their relationships, what do you think would be kind of step one into dealing with that, whether it be a full-fledged addiction or just maybe overindulging?
Great question, Andrew. And it sounds like you're referring about the culture of medicine. And as we know,
Yes.
Medicine has a tradition of expecting docs to be superhuman and to not experience the same types of stress, or if they do, to be able to manage it perfectly. So there's a real traditional stigma against docs asking for help. It makes it difficult, but fortunately we are seeing more and more, especially young docs these days, who are coming out and speaking up about having behavioral health conditions themselves. As a general kind of response, reaching out and showing support to someone that you care about is always welcome. So if you observe, say, a colleague who seems to be having a difficult time in some way, they might be anxious, depressed, especially during the COVID pandemic, or there might be a question of use of substances possibly becoming problematic. Perhaps the best approach would be to reach out to that individual, maybe, sit down, invite them out for a cup of coffee or for a lunch, and just show some attention, show some caring, ask them how it's going for them. If one approaches it in a non-judgmental, just an empathic, caring, supportive approach, people appreciate that. They oftentimes will at some point open up over time and start talking about what might really be going on. And then you can always make a general suggestion or general offer to be available if there's anything that you can do to help. Basically presenting oneself as a judgment-free resource and support who truly cares about that individual.
Yeah, I think that's great. It is the superhuman comment is certainly true in all aspects of our lives and careers, and I do feel that my generation and younger are starting to realize that it is okay to have feelings, and it is okay to be overworked and overstressed and to talk about such things. And we do, unfortunately, sometimes suffer from the maladies of the general public, whether that be mental health, whether that be substance problems. So I think those are great points. Since you mentioned stigma, I'd like to talk about that a little bit more. And there certainly is a stigma towards healthcare professionals with substance use, and on the flip side, towards patients with substance use. I mean, I'm an emergency physician, and certainly it can be very challenging when the same patient comes in again and again, or the family keeps bringing in the patient to the emergency department because they're at their wit's end. And I certainly see a lot of it over the years from my colleagues and the support staff. Here's XYZ again. They're just, insert whatever words you want to say. Right. So, how do we deal with that in ourselves and with our colleagues? In the emergency room, I probably have less than 5 minutes to establish a rapport with each patient.
Yeah, challenging, Andrew. 5 minutes or less. I remember back in the early days of my training, I did a lot of emergency room consultation with addiction, and it was one of the emergency docs had this expression called "Gomer." Get out of my emergency room. 30 years ago, that certainly was the prevailing sentiment. To recognize addiction as a chronic illness, a chronic condition, much like asthma or diabetes or hypertension. If we as providers think in terms of changing the lens, changing how we view the patient. For example, if this was an individual whose diabetes was unstable and needed to come back multiple times to the ED, we wouldn't think much of it. We'd be glad that they were coming back for help. So applying that kind of lens to addiction can really be helpful to cut through the unconscious biases that we all have growing up in this society about substance use and how we should be able to handle it, and about addiction as a moral failing. So I think comparing to other chronic medical conditions is a great way to cut through that in our own minds. When we can learn with patients with compassion and understanding and treat them in that kind of way, just very matter-of-factly, as if it was someone struggling to get their hypertension under control, patients respond to that and tend to do better and tend to be more compliant with recommendations, the medical care.
Yeah, that's I never really thought of it that way. I definitely say things like, it's a disease like anything else, but I think talking about framing it in the sense of it being a chronic disease like diabetes or hypertension, and you wouldn't be disgusted with that person. That's a good point. I like that a lot. That's I'm going to use that. Well, so I think we talked about reaching out to other, maybe our colleagues, and some of the biases that we've inherited over time, and some strategies to deal with that. But I know, you really work a lot with families. So how, as physicians, how do we take our doctor hat off if we have a struggling family member and deal with perhaps a brother or sister, a mother or son that has an addiction issue as healthcare professionals, as doctors? How do we deal with something like that when it's, we see it all day, every day at work, and then we come home and we don't know what to do anymore?
It helps to take the doctor hat off, to be real and to be approachable when you're reaching out to a loved one or a friend that you're concerned about. A person who is having difficulties with substance use, they're already feeling ashamed. They're already blaming themselves. They already feel like, quote, losers, unquote. So they're beating themselves up already. And the best thing we can do is to lift them up by approaching them with a very respectful, understanding, empathic kind of approach. And then to put the hat back on and to use the words and to deliberately communicate to that person that we're concerned about, describing addiction as a medical illness, a medical condition, and using comparisons, for example, to other chronic medical conditions. Saying those words can be very useful in developing a comfort level with your friend, your loved one. And so deliberately saying sometimes there is a resumption of use. Sometimes people need a more than one treatment episode or experience until they are, gaining health and recovery. So I think spelling out and using those words and speaking to our loved one with that kind of information can be so important. And I don't know that we necessarily automatically do that by nature. For example, I know that with me and my nature, Irish Catholic upbringing, I've had to work at expressing, emotion and empathy and using the words. I always felt it towards people, but it was not natural for me to express it. Saying those things, that this is a medical condition, is there anything I can do to help, is very comforting. Dr. Sarah Wakeman has a expression which has been so helpful. Patients don't fail treatment. Treatment fails patients. And it can be so liberating and comforting to say that and to point out that just because you didn't do well with this treatment doesn't mean that you did anything wrong. It means that the treatment needs to be reevaluated and tailored. Similar with a cancer patient. If a person's cancer comes back after treatment, we would never think of blaming the patient. So why would we even think about that with addiction? So that concept I find very useful. And the patients, the people with addiction that I work with, and the families, they find it so useful as well. And it's such a relief for family members when they can love their family member, their loved one. They can establish a loving relationship with them and let go of some of the frustration, some of the anger, and just deal with them in that kind of manner. It's so comforting and liberating for the families and for the individuals as well.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think the cancer analogy as well is really powerful. Or, like you talked about diabetes, perhaps certain medicines aren't working for that patient that doesn't have anything to do with them. Right.
Right.
That's, or other psychiatric conditions, same point, right? There's certain drugs work for certain people. Same thing with the treatment. So I like that a lot. Well, I want to talk a little bit more about your journey, Patrick. So, as a social worker, I have some idea of what that entails. But I think for our early career docs and perhaps other people listening, maybe some of the struggles you've gone through along the way. I mean, you touched on it, given your upbringing and being able to infuse empathy into your words and how you deal with patients and other people. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about your own journey.
Well, thank you, Andy. I grew up in a large family. I was one of 7 kids. It was a loving family. It was also a high stress family. And so sometimes the discipline could be a little harsh. It was a great environment to grow up in, and it was also really challenging, really difficult as a child. In my teen years, I developed depression. didn't know what it was, and I certainly couldn't admit it to anyone. Struggled through high school with depression. When I went off to college, I first got treatment for depression. It was really useful for me. And at one point, I took a year off just before I was entering my senior year of undergrad, and realized, well, number one, I couldn't stop crying. So it's hard to attend classes and, function as a student when you cannot stop crying. But also I was so concerned about my career. I was a biology undergrad, and I knew that I didn't want to do lab work. So what else was I going to do? So I ended up taking that year off. Got into psychotherapy with a great therapist, including group therapy. Taking that year off was the best decision I could ever have made. The therapy was very effective, and I got into a recovery. I was so appreciative and grateful to my therapist and to the psychotherapy and psychiatry, the way I'd benefited from it, that I became very interested in learning more about it. Got a job in mental health. Actually applied to medical school a couple of times. Social work, so initially was my fallback plan. But in hindsight, I'm really glad that life brought me to where I was. Loved social work, and it's helped me do what I do. Also, as time has gone by, I've become more open and sometimes self-disclosing about my recovery from depression with people I'm working with families, and becoming more of a real person in that sense. What I found is that it's really helped develop a rapport and trust and a relationship with people that I'm helping. While I wouldn't want that to be a distraction when used like judiciously, I find it very useful. It helps me feel comfortable about being who I am. That's been my experience. Also with the struggles in my early years, my childhood, I wish my family had been able to get help as a family. So that's really given me a personal mission to offer that support and education and helping families out who are struggling with different issues as a way of giving back to something that I wish I had available in my childhood.
Yeah, that's very, very powerful, Patrick. Thank you for sharing that. I think that definitely would help. Sharing some of that with your patients, I can only imagine it would help and not hinder your progress with them. So thank you for that.
Sure.
You mentioned in the kind of the pre-call that you've seen some maybe parallels to early career social work and early career doctors. Maybe you could touch on that a little bit.
For me, going into social work, it was the training was intense and demanding and challenging, not so much in terms of the actual work involved, but more in terms of time. There was a lot of time involved. And as a social worker starting off in the field, the work that we do can be stressful. We are confronted with people's emotional, psychological pain. There's a lot of stress that impacts us. I imagine that docs are going through that. It's really important to recognize that and to acknowledge it to ourselves and to trusted colleagues, people that we feel comfortable with, and to open up about the stress of that. And when we're going through a particularly hard time, to feel understood is very powerful. And we cannot feel understood unless we are being real and opening up about that. And that's one thing I think is great about this new generation of young physicians entering the field, is that a lot of them are being very open about their struggles and about the struggles of the work. That's so healthy and so positive. And I think that will really serve them well. If there's only one piece of information or guidance or advice I would have to share, it would be to anyone struggling out there, reach out and have a conversation with someone. Talk about, wow, this is really difficult, especially during the pandemic, right? This is really stressful. There's a lot of uncertainty in the world and a lot of conflict in the country. What we experience, especially, frontline and essential healthcare workers and other frontline workers, it's not easy. And to have someone that you can be honest with about that is just so important. And it refuels us, it's restorative, it helps us heal. And helps us continue and get up and do it all again the next day as well.
Yeah, that's so true, Patrick. I think definitely we see it more with the current generation. I've said it before on this show that my residency was certainly the worst 3 years of my life. And luckily I had my wife, to be able to talk to, who was going through a similar situation. But, for the residents out there, find somebody you trust and that you can talk to. And I think social media has also really helped people kind of air their frustrations, these days as well, and kind of find that they're not the only ones out there. And I think that's also bringing some of the mid-career docs into the fray, seeing on Facebook groups and other things that, you're not the only one feeling burnt out. You're not the only one feeling the way you feel. And it is very helpful to be able to talk to others doing the same thing.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing I will say, being involved in Twitter has really been such an enhancement for me. Not only my learning about science and medicine relative, especially to addiction, but also in terms of developing friendships with people of like mind and similar values. It's been really a wonderful experience. You see a lot of courageous self-disclosure on social media, which it's infectious in a positive way. It encourages others to do that as well. I know that I draw a lot of inspiration from people who are opening up and disclosing about things that back in the day when I was in training, I never heard anybody talking about these kinds of personal struggles. It's so positive, healthy, and refreshing. It's encouraging. And these are times when any kind of encouragement that we can find is just so important, so valuable. It's really been a positive experience for me.
I agree. Yeah. We wouldn't be talking right now if not for Twitter, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I heard that the interview that you did with two gay docs, to hear them describe what they went through in their lives and in their training, their medical training, and where they are now. It's been a journey for them. It's fascinating to hear about that kind of struggle, and it's very encouraging and inspirational. So yeah, that was a very compelling episode.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. For those listening who haven't listened, the episode he's referring to is with Dr. Chase Anderson and Dr. Carl Street, which is arguably my most popular episode ever. So,
really?
Yes. So that was a really wonderful episode. Hard at times, certainly very hard to listen to, but I salute them for their courage in coming on and sharing and inspiring the next generation.
Yeah, it's a compelling episode, Andrew. It's compelling. I mean, I'm not surprised to hear that it's your most popular. It's definitely worth a listen.
Well, Patrick, I just want to shift the show a little bit just to get to know you a little bit more. So besides doing the great work that you do, what do you like to do for fun?
I love working out. I love exercising, and I always have. My current state of exercise, it's primarily on the treadmill. I've got my treadmill in my basement, and I play classic rock music like Van Halen, for example, up-tempo, loud, and it gets me going. It gives me so much energy and can do so much for not only us physically, but my mood and my energy level. Hanging out with friends, sometimes via Zoom, and also developing my podcast series, learning more how to interview people and how to bring out the most useful, helpful information from people that are fascinating. Many of the families that I work with do agree to participate and to be interviewed. It really does bring a lot of great information to the world. And for them, they want to do that. They want to pay it forward and help out other families who are struggling like they have. Podcasting is my hobby now, and I've really enjoyed it. And I'm looking forward to my now going into the second year of creating more interesting episodes.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a lot of fun, just getting to meet virtually and talk to different people and share their experiences has been really rewarding for me as well. Where can we find that podcast now that you mention it?
It's on www.familyaddictioncoach.com, my website. And the name of the podcast is Family Addiction Coaching Podcast. It's available on Apple Podcasts, on Google, on all the major hosts.
Great. I'll put it in the show notes for the listeners. Patrick, do you have a book recommendation for everybody?
One book that I really enjoyed is Beautiful Boy, written by David Sheff, which later became made into a movie. It's a really powerful book. It gives a good glimpse, number one, that people can recover from addiction. As we see, David Sheff's real-life son, Nick, does get into a recovery, and he's been in recovery from methamphetamine addiction and also bipolar disorder. It also shows the family's difficulties getting science-based treatment from the treatment industry. Another book I would highly recommend is High Price, written by Dr. Carl Hart from Columbia. And I love Dr. Carl Hart's theories and ideas about drug use and about taking the stigma away and also separating out racist drug policies from looking at how we use substances. So Dr. Carl Hart, if you ever have a chance to read that book, High Price, he also has a new book coming out in January, Drug Use for Adults. But if you ever have a chance to watch Dr. Carl Hart, he's fascinating. I find his ideas really useful in my work.
Yeah, I will add those both to my never-ending list. But yeah, that sounds great. So, Patrick, you mentioned your website. How else can people find you if they're interested in learning more?
Well, I'm very active on Twitter at Patrick Doyle _35. I've also got a Psychology Today profile. I'm a member of the Psychology Today directory online. I'm also at Patrick at familyaddictioncoach.com. I offer a free initial consultation to families where I can give them some feedback, give suggestions, recommendations. And if families wish to pursue the professional coaching, which is fee-based, following that, I would be more than happy to do that, to be able to offer some ideas that they find helpful, even in just one consultation. It's really very gratifying. There's also another website that I would recommend highly, Andrew. It's called alliesinrecovery.net. Allies in Recovery uses a lot of the CRAFT method, and during this pandemic, they've waived their subscription fees, and basically families can go online, set up an account with alliesinrecovery.net, and learn through these e-learning modules about the CRAFT method. They also talk a lot about harm reduction, about helping people stay as safe as possible, even if they're not ready to pursue treatment or to pursue abstinence from substances. And I do a lot of harm reduction in my work as well, keeping people alive so that they can be around to fight another day. And oftentimes they do come back to us. They can reach to a point where they're ready for getting some sort of help and turn their lives around.
Great. I will put all that in the show notes for the listeners. Well, Patrick, that's all we have for today, but thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your insights with the audience. This has been a really wonderful episode.
Andrew, it's my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for the great work that you're doing, not only in the emergency room, but also with your podcast as well. And I'll continue to listen to your episodes.
Well, thank you for your support, Patrick. We'll be in touch. Wow, that was a powerful episode with Patrick. It was really interesting to hear about his own battle with depression, leading him to a social work career. I also found it shocking that his approach brings 70% of those suffering from addiction into treatment. It was really interesting how Patrick discussed the reinforcing positive behaviors and downplaying negatives, similar to raising children and those suffering from addiction. I also appreciated the discussion of the culture of medicine in regards to addiction and how to think about those suffering from addiction as chronic illness. There's so much in this show. I'm probably going to listen to it a few times. That's all we have for today, but thank you again for listening. To help disseminate this show, Please leave me an honest rating and review on Apple Podcasts and share with your family, friends, and colleagues. I really appreciate it. The other thing I'd like you to do after listening is to follow me on Instagram at talk_me_DOC_LLC. In addition to podcasts, I post lots of very interesting career advice for early and mid-career physicians. You could also find me on my website at andrewtisserdo.com. For those of you who are suffering from career dissatisfaction and need some extra help, reach out to me and we'll schedule a free strategy session to determine how I can help you reach your goals. That's all I have for today. Remember, keep talking. All opinions expressed by the guest in this episode are solely the guest's opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Andrew Tisser DO, Talk to Me Doc LLC, or any affiliates thereof. The guest's opinions are based upon information he or she considers reliable, but Andrew Tisser DO, Talk to Me Doc LLC, nor any affiliates thereof warrant its completeness or accuracy. The guest, Andrew Tisser DO, Talk to Me Doc LLC, or any affiliates thereof are not under any obligation to update or correct any information provided in this episode. The guest statements and opinions are subject to change without notice.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Family Addiction Coaching. And if you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the show. We'll continue to interview interesting and strong families as long as there is a need for this information in the community. Make sure to visit our website, www.opioidcoaching.com. If you think you might want professional coaching for yourself or your family, Patrick Doyle is available. Have a peaceful day.